HOA, tore down my mountain. Mansion over fines. But they accidentally destroyed the governor's house. I watched as the bulldozers climbed the mountain road, engines roaring like monsters in the fog. The HOA president stood there with a smile, a paper in her hand. Fines unpaid, she said. Demolition ordered, she said. And then the walls of my mansion began to fall, stone by stone, dust rising into the morning sky. But what they didn't know, what none of them realized, was that the house they just tore down wasn't even mine. Welcome to HOA Secrets Uncovered. My name is Daniel Reed. I live on the edge of the mountain community where silence should have been peace, but the HOA turned it into war. I built my dream mansion here with my own hands, with my own sweat, and still they came after me with their petty rules and crushing fines. But this story is about the day they went too far and ended up tearing down the governor's house instead of mine. HOA tore down my mountain mansion over fines. But they accidentally destroyed the governor's house. I stood in the cold mountain air as the dust settled around me. My throat was dry. My hands shook. I could taste grit on my tongue. The sun was still low behind the ridge, and the light came in thin blades through the pine trees. Engines idled somewhere below the slope. Voices flickered in and out like static, and I kept thinking about one thing. The house that just fell was not mine. The HOA president had arrived at dawn with a smile that did not move her eyes. She held a white paper like a trophy. Unpaid fines, she said. Violation of code, she said. Demolition, today, she said. Her words were soft, but the machines behind her were loud. Men in yellow helmets lined up like chess pieces. They did not look at me. They only looked at the paper, and at her, and at the house on the ridge. I tried to speak, but the first blade cut into the wall, and the sound drowned my voice. Stone cracked. Glass shattered. The mountain threw the echo back at us. I felt something in me break with it. I reached for my folder of deeds and permits, names and numbers and stamps I knew by heart. But the president kept talking about rules and order and community standards. She said the board had voted. She said I had lost my appeals. She said the time for discussion was over. The bulldozer pushed again. A beam snapped. Dust rose like a storm. It tasted like old wood and iron and a life that took years to build. I had picked every plank and every stone. I had pressed my palm into the wet concrete of that front step and signed it with my thumb. I had watched the stonemason fit the fireplace by hand. I had counted the knots in the timber of the great room and told myself each knot was a day of work I would never forget. I wanted to run forward and grab the machine with my bare hands, but I knew they would stop me. I knew they would call the sheriff. I knew they would tell the story as a man who fought the rules and lost. So I stood in the raw wind and watched my dream fall. Or what I thought was my dream. Because the fog shifted, a gust came down from the ridge and pulled the veil off the valley. And that was when I saw the gate across the road. Same iron pattern, same stone pillars, same dark cedar stain that the design book from the HOA called Mountain Harmony. 2 houses, twin faces, one on my parcel, one on the parcel across the road. Both built by the same developer, both finished the same season, and for the first time that morning I saw the numbers stenciled on the curb under the dust. I rubbed my eyes, I blinked hard. The numbers on my curb were mine. The numbers on the gate across the road were not, a worker shouted. Another worker waved his arms and pointed not at me but past me. The foreman jumped from his truck. He had a clipboard with a map and a lot number and a set of coordinates. He squinted at the map. He squinted at the ridge. He squinted at the house that was now missing half a wall and a roof like a broken jaw. Then he looked at the gate across the road. He swore under his breath. He called someone on the radio. Static hissed back at him like a snake. The president was still talking about compliance and community when the foreman stepped close to her and whispered. She stopped. Her lips held the last word halfway. I could see the color leave her face like someone pulled a plug. She glanced at the clipboard. She glanced at the road. She glanced at me as if my eyes would tell her a different truth. Then she said one word that did not sound like victory. No. More radios clicked. More voices rose. The men in helmets began to walk slowly backward from the machine like a tide leaving the beach. One of them took off his helmet and ran a hand through his hair and stared at the ground as if a hole would open and swallow him. Another stared at the gate across the road and whispered a prayer. I could not hear the words, but I knew the shape of fear when I saw it. Every HOA letter I ever got had that shape. Every pink slip stuffed under my door had that shape. Rules are fear dressed in a suit. I walked past the president. Her perfume was sharp in the cold air. She reached for my arm. I slipped away. I walked to the curb and kneeled in the dust and brushed the numbers with my sleeve. My numbers, my parcel, my deed in the county office. I stood and looked at the gate across the road. The wind carried the sound of a distant engine, then two more. Black cars climbing the switchbacks like slow shadows. I knew those plates. Everyone in this state knew those plates. The foreman swallowed. His jaw worked like he was chewing a nail. He told his crew to shut everything down. One by one the engines died. Silence moved in. You could hear the ravens on the far slope. You could hear the drip of dew from the eaves of the house that was now half a house. You could hear the paper in the president's hand shake against her ring as if it were windy only where she stood. I remembered the first notice the HOA sent me. Grass too high, they said. I measured the blades with a ruler and cut them to the exact number on page 12 of the handbook. Then they said my deck was too wide. I hired the original contractor and trimmed it 2 inches and sent photos with timestamps. Then they said my dog barked at 3 a.m. I was out of town that night. I sent flight records. They fined me anyway. They said fines double after 30 days. Then they triple. They said a lien was a natural step. They said demolition is an ultimate remedy for property out of compliance. Community standards, they said. Harmony, they said. And now harmony stood like a cracked statue in the dust. The first black car reached the gate across the road. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door. A man in a dark suit put one foot on the gravel and paused to look up the slope. Behind him another car stopped and another. I could not see his face yet, but I did not need to. The governor liked this mountain for retreats and quiet meetings. He liked the private road and the quiet air and the distance from everything noisy. He liked that the HOA kept things neat. He liked the house that looked a lot like mine. The president tried to gather herself. She straightened her jacket. She pressed the paper flat against her palm. She walked toward the new arrivals with that same smile that never reached her eyes. But her shoes slipped a little on the dust and left a mark on the concrete like a nervous heartbeat. The foreman followed 2 steps behind. He held the clipboard tight as if it might float away. The crew kept their heads down. One of them looked at me and his eyes said, "I am sorry without a word." I thought about all the nights I lay in my great room and watched the fire turn wood into light. I thought about the smell of coffee in the morning and the way the windows held the sunrise like a painting. I thought about how hard I fought to hold my home against a board that wanted to make me small, and I felt something new, not rage, not grief, something colder and cleaner, like the first stream water you drink on a long hike. It was the feeling you get when the mountain itself chooses a side. The man in the dark suit stepped fully out of the car. He looked at the house across the road. Then he looked at the half house on my ridge. His face did not move much, but his eyes were sharp like broken slate. He spoke to the president in a voice I could not hear from where I stood. She answered and showed the paper. He did not take it. He pointed at the clipboard. The foreman handed it over with hands that did not seem to belong to him. The governor read. He turned the clipboard sideways. He checked the map. He looked up at the ridge. For a moment the whole mountain held its breath. Then his eyes met mine across the road and across the dust and the broken beams. He gave me a small nod, not friendly, not angry, a nod that meant, "I see," a nod that meant, "Keep standing." A hawk circled high over the valley. The wind changed and the dust drifted away from my mouth and I could breathe again. I watched. Did the president's smile collapse at the edges? I watched the foreman wait for a command like a soldier who has marched into the wrong war. I watched the governor lift the radio from his aide's hand and speak slowly and clearly, so no one could pretend not to hear. And I knew that whatever came next would not be quiet. The engines died one by one, and the silence felt heavier than the noise. The governor's men stood by the cars. Tall, dark suits like shadows on gravel. The HOA president's hands shook, though she tried to hide them in her jacket pockets. The foreman's clipboard tilted in his grip, his knuckles pale white. And I just stood still with dust in my hair and grit between my teeth. It felt like the mountain itself was holding its breath. The governor stepped closer. His polished shoes left crisp marks on the road where the dust had not yet settled. He looked not at me, not at the half-destroyed mansion behind me, but straight at the president. Her smile cracked again. Forced lines that no longer obeyed her. She raised the paper with the demolition order like a shield, but the governor didn't even blink. He asked one question in a voice that cut through everything. "Whose house is this?" The president swallowed. Her lips moved, but no sound came. She glanced at the foreman, at the clipboard, at the machines. Finally, she whispered my name, but even she knew it sounded wrong. The governor's aide stepped forward and read the lot number aloud. He compared it to the curb marker. He compared it to the clipboard map. Then he pointed to the gate across the road, the house that was untouched. Still standing proud in the pale light, the aide's voice was sharp. "That house is yours, sir. This house is not." The president staggered back one step as if the words had weight. The foreman looked like he wanted to melt into the gravel. The crew shifted uneasily, men rubbing the back of their necks, helmets held against their chests. I wanted to shout. I wanted to laugh, but the silence was stronger than both. The governor slowly turned his gaze to me. His eyes were hard as stone. He studied me like a man studies a contract before signing. I did not move. I did not speak. I simply let him see me standing among the rubble of what was supposed to be mine. He gave another small nod, not of kindness, not of pity, a nod of recognition, like a witness acknowledging another witness. Then he spoke again. "Who authorized this?" The president's voice finally broke through the dust. She said it was the board. She said it was policy. She said it was community protection. Her words spilled fast and sloppy like water from a cracked pipe. But the governor raised a hand and her excuses died mid-sentence. His lawyer appeared from the second car, briefcase in one hand, phone in the other. He was already making calls before he reached the gate. Names and statutes flowed from his mouth like a river. The HOA president's face lost all color. The foreman kept his eyes on the ground. The workers pretended to check their machines, but everyone knew the show was over. I walked closer to the ruins of my mansion. The walls leaned like tired soldiers. The roof sagged in the middle where a beam had split. I bent down and picked up a chunk of stone. Cold and heavy in my palm, I remembered the day I chose it at the quarry. The mason said it would last 100 years. It lasted 3 under the HOA. I clenched it tight and let the dust smear across my fingers. It did not feel like loss anymore. It felt like evidence. The governor's voice carried again across the slope. "This will be corrected. The board will answer. Compensation will be arranged." The last word echoed longer than the others. Compensation. The president tried to speak again, but her voice cracked into nothing. The lawyer was already handing her papers. Her eyes darted left and right like a cornered animal. She turned to me as if I might save her, but I only stared back. The crew began to pack their equipment in silence. One by one, the bulldozers crawled down the mountain road. The sound of their engines grew smaller and smaller, until all that was left was the wind through the pines. I stood there with the stone still in my hand and the governor still watching. Finally, he spoke to me. "You fought them." His words were not a question. I nodded once. He said good, and then he turned away to his car. The black doors closed. Engines started again. The caravan rolled down the slope like shadows returning to the valley. Only then did the president breathe out a long, shaky sigh. She looked at me with eyes full of hate and fear all twisted together. She whispered, "You will regret this." And I whispered back, "No, you will." I stayed on that mountain until the sun climbed high. Neighbors began to appear at their porches. They stared at the broken house, at the empty machines, at me standing alone in the dust. Whispers floated across fences, some with pity, some with awe, some with fear that their own homes might be next. But one thing was certain. The HOA had cracked, their mask had slipped, and everyone saw it. I walked into what was left of my mansion. The floor creaked under my boots. Dust floated in golden beams of sunlight through shattered windows. I touched the broken fireplace. I ran my fingers along the splintered banister. Every scar told a story, but I felt no sorrow, only a strange calm, because now the board would bleed. The governor's men would not stop. His lawyers would not stop. Every paper, every vote, every hidden account of the HOA would be dragged into daylight, and I would stand there watching, the same way I watched my walls fall, because sometimes the best revenge is not striking back with your own hands. It is letting arrogance pull the trigger against itself. That night I sat on the mountain slope. Stars lit the sky brighter than the city below. I thought of every neighbor who had been fined for mailbox paint, every family who had been threatened over grass height, every old man who had been bullied into silence by the board. I thought of them all, and I smiled in the dark, because the tide had turned, and no fence could stop it now. The mountain looked different the next morning. The mist was heavier, the air colder. The ruins of my mansion still smoking like the bones of a fire that refused to die. I stood on the edge of the ridge with my coffee in one hand and silence in the other. The night before had been long, full of headlights on the road, neighbors whispering through fences, calls from reporters who somehow already knew what had happened. But the strangest sound of all was the quiet from the HOA. No letters, no emails, no knocks at the door, only silence. And in a community where silence was forbidden, that silence was louder than any fine. By noon, the board had called an emergency meeting at the clubhouse. Everyone was invited. Everyone came. Curiosity pulls harder than fear when power begins to slip. I walked down the mountain road toward the clubhouse, and every step felt like the ground was waiting for a storm. The people who once avoided me, who once crossed the street when I passed, now walked beside me. They whispered my name. They asked what would happen next. They told me their own stories of fines and threats and humiliation. One woman said they fined her for planting roses instead of tulips. One man said they threatened to tow his car because it had dust on the bumper. Another said they charged him a fee because his curtains were the wrong shade of beige. Each story was another crack in the mask the HOA had worn for years. When I reached the clubhouse, the parking lot was already overflowing. Cars lined the road like soldiers waiting for orders. Inside, the air was thick with sweat and perfume and fear. The board sat at the front table. 7 chairs, 7 faces pale and stiff. The president in the middle still tried to hold her smile, but it twitched like a weak muscle. Beside her, the treasurer clutched a folder too tight. The secretary tapped her nails on the table like a clock counting down. The meeting began with her voice, calm but shaking. She said the demolition was a misunderstanding. She said the workers confused the lot numbers. She said the HOA bore no responsibility for private contractors. But the room did not believe her. You could feel it. Murmurs spread like fire through dry grass. Eyes narrowed, arms folded. Neighbors who once feared the board now smelled blood. I raised my hand. The room went quiet. The president hesitated before nodding at me. I asked one question. If you can tear down a house by mistake, what else can you do without care? The words hung heavy in the air. Even the board members shifted in their seats, because they knew the answer was simple: anything. The treasurer tried to change the subject. He opened his folder and spoke about community standards, property values, harmony of design. But each word felt hollow. A man in the back shouted that his fees had doubled last year without a vote. A woman near the front demanded to know why her lien notice was signed by the president. Alone, voices rose. The board lost control, and for the first time in years, the people realized they were stronger together than apart. The governor's lawyer appeared at the doorway. His presence froze the room. He held a thin briefcase and his tie was still perfectly straight even after the climb up the mountain. He walked to the front without a word and placed the briefcase on the table. The president tried to speak, but he raised his hand. Silence fell like a curtain. He opened the briefcase and pulled out papers, thick, stamped, official. He read aloud the governor's declaration. Effective immediately, all HOA board activities were under investigation, all accounts frozen, all decisions suspended. Any attempt to enforce fines or liens would be considered void until further notice. The president's jaw dropped. The treasurer's folder slipped from his hand and scattered papers across the floor. The secretary stopped tapping her nails. The room erupted. Cheers, laughter, applause that shook the old wood beams of the clubhouse ceiling. I sat back and watched. For the first time, I did not feel like a target. I felt like a witness to justice. The lawyer gathered his papers and left without another word. He did not need to say more. The board sat frozen, powerless, and everyone knew it. After the meeting, neighbors swarmed me. Some clapped my shoulder, some hugged me, some simply said thank you. It was strange to be their symbol, their proof that the board could be beaten. But I carried it with quiet pride, because I knew the fight was not over. The board would not surrender without a final strike, and people drunk on power rarely know when to let go. That night I returned to the ruins of my mansion. The wind was sharp, the stars clear. I walked through the broken rooms with only a lantern. Every shadow looked longer than it should. Every creak sounded like footsteps behind me. I felt the weight of eyes on me, though no one was there. And in that silence, I realized the board would not forgive me for standing against them. They would come again, not with bulldozers maybe, but with something darker, something quieter. Because when power falls, it does not disappear. It hides and waits. The lantern flickered in my hand, and I asked myself if I was ready, and the mountain whispered back with cold air that yes, I was. The wind carried a strange chill that morning, the kind that makes your skin crawl even when the sun is shining. I stood among the ruins of my mansion with a mug of coffee gone cold in my hand. The ashes still smelled of smoke and dust and broken pride. But what unsettled me most was not the rubble, it was the silence. The HOA had vanished from sight. No letters slipped under doors, no late-night calls with blocked numbers, no threats of liens or notices pasted on fences. The board was silent, too silent. And silence like that was not surrender, it was planning. Neighbors came to me more often now. They whispered at my gate, sometimes in fear, sometimes in hope. One man said he saw board members meeting at night in the clubhouse parking lot with no lights on. Another said the president drove away at midnight with her trunk full of boxes. The treasurer had not been seen in days. The secretary stopped answering calls. It was as if the board had dissolved into shadows. But shadows don't dissolve. They wait. One evening I heard footsteps outside my ruined walls. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the cracked porch. The beam of light caught a figure moving fast toward the trees. A neighbor, maybe. Or someone else, I called out, but no answer came, only the sound of twigs breaking under hurried feet. When I reached the edge of the woods, the figure was gone. Only a folded paper remained on the dirt path. I bent down and picked it up. My name was written on the front in sharp black ink. I opened it under the lantern light. It was not a notice. It was not a fine. It was a warning. 3 words: you will pay. The paper shook in my hand, though the wind was calm. I looked around the empty trees. The silence pressed heavy on my chest. I folded the note and slipped it into my pocket. Because threats are not proof, but they are promises. The next morning I went to the clubhouse. The doors were locked, but the blinds inside were crooked like someone had pulled them too fast. I walked around to the back and found cigarette butts still warm near the trash bins. The smell of coffee lingered in the air, though no one was there. Someone had been inside. Someone was still using the clubhouse even while the board claimed to be gone. I knocked on neighbors' doors. I asked questions. Some admitted they saw people coming and going late at night. Others pretended they knew nothing. Fear does that to people. They want to stay invisible. They want to believe that if they keep quiet, the storm will pass them by. But storms don't pass quietly in the mountains. They break. By evening, another note arrived. This one pinned to the remains of my front gate. The handwriting was the same, the words sharper, leave or burn. I read it twice, then a third time, my hands steady now instead of shaking, because fear only works if you let it. I walked back inside the ruins and placed the note beside the first on the broken mantel. 2 promises from people who thought shadows could scare me, but I had the mountain on my side, and the governor watching from the valley below. Later that night I heard voices drifting through the wind. I followed the sound down the slope toward the clubhouse. The lot was dark, but the side door glowed faint under the moonlight. I crept closer. Through a crack in the blinds I saw them. The board, the president, the treasurer, the secretary, and 2 others I barely recognized. Their faces pale, their voices sharp. They spoke of debts, of mistakes, of the governor's lawyers circling like vultures. They spoke of me too, always me, how I had turned neighbors against them, how I had made them weak, how I had to be silenced before everything collapsed. I stepped back into the shadows, my breath slow, my heart loud. They were plotting, but they were also afraid. Their fear leaked through every word, every twitch of their hands. They knew the end was near, but they wanted to drag me down with them. The next day, neighbors gathered at my ruined gate without invitation. Word had spread. People were angry, not just at what they did to me, but at years of fines, threats, humiliation. The HOA had ruled with fear for too long, and now the fear was turning against them. We stood there in the dust, mothers with strollers, old men with canes, young families tired of silence. One by one they told their stories, and with every story the fire grew hotter. The board was losing its grip. The people wanted justice, not tomorrow, not next month. Now I listened quietly, because anger needs space to breathe. And when the voices finally fell quiet, I told them what I had seen. The secret meetings, the warnings left on my gate, the threats, the faces of fear inside the clubhouse. Gasps echoed through the crowd. No one doubted me. They had seen enough themselves. We decided together. The board would not be allowed to hide in shadows anymore. We would drag them into daylight. Every paper, every account, every secret. That night I lit a fire in what was left of my great room. Not for warmth, but as a beacon. Neighbors gathered again, and I knew the board could see the glow from the clubhouse. The mountain no longer belonged to them. It belonged to us. But as the flames crackled and faces glowed in the firelight, I asked myself one question. How far would they go to keep power when they had nothing left to lose? The firelight had barely died when the real work began. We could not wait for papers or promises. Not after they left my home in ruins. People needed proof, and proof was the only thing that would strip power from fear. I walked the mountain roads at dawn with a notebook and a flashlight. Neighbors trailed behind me like a slow river of faces. Quiet but steady, we split into small groups. A few watched the clubhouse. Some checked bank statements and receipts they had saved from years of fines and fees. Others followed board members when they left town in expensive cars at odd hours. We moved like ants, small and patient and impossible to stop once we found a line of trail. The clubhouse had cameras, old ones that blinked when the power went out. We knew which nights the board met in shadow. So we listened. We watched. On a Tuesday, a woman from 2 houses down followed the treasurer to a storage unit off the main road. She texted me. "Come now," she wrote. "Bring nothing that can be traced." We drove quietly and watched while the treasurer used a key coded to his name. He opened the unit and a light flooded out across the gravel. He lifted boxes. He moved slowly. He did not know he was being watched. Later that night we crept back when the wind was low and the moon was thin. I slipped a small camera through a gap in the door and let it record while we waited in the dark. For 3 hours, nothing happened, but the quiet felt heavy like a held breath. Then a woman's voice came from the storage unit. "The president," I think she said. "Hand me the envelope and the list." A paper hit the floor. Footsteps came closer to the door where we hid. My hand was cold on the camera. If we were caught, we would be accused of trespass. If we were not caught, we might find the thing that would end them. When the door closed and the treasurer left, I moved in. The camera had captured a stack of ledgers, envelopes, a small safe behind a false panel. I pried the panel with a screwdriver, and the safe slid out like it had been waiting to be found. Inside were check stubs, unnamed transfers, cash wrapped in grocery bags, and a folded list with names and numbers and notes like payments and favors and dates. I felt my heart beat in my throat. This was not just greed. It was something planned and kept like a map to power. We took photos with our phones. We copied pages into memory cards. And then we left the storage unit as if nothing had happened. Later that night, we compared notes in my ruined great room with the lamp low and maps spread on the floor. The list showed payments to a contractor who never completed work. Payments to an account in a nearby town. Payments labeled with words that made no sense unless you knew how the board hid things. Someone had been stealing from the community and hiding it in plain sight. The next morning, the treasurer's car was sprayed with paint on the driver's side. A note was tucked into the door handle. "A warning long as your greed," he wrote. The board called the police and cried vandalism, but the officers who came were not fools. They looked at the paint, at the neat lines and the sharp letters, and they looked at the ledger photos the neighbors handed them. It was hard to say whether the officers were more shocked by the public anger or the clear paper trail we had left on their tablets. Either way, the seed of doubt had been planted. The board struck back quietly at first. Small things meant to rattle us. A neighbor's mailbox was torn off its post in the night. Tires were slashed on a family car that had spoken out at the meeting. A dog was poisoned, and the note left near the path said, "Stay out of this." Fear came back like a fog. I thought about leaving the mountain for a while, about taking a flight and pretending this had all been a bad dream, but the ledger burned in my pocket like a coal. If I left now, the trail might die and the money would stay hidden where it could keep buying silence. So we changed tactics. We went public with what we had. Carefully and slow, I met the governor's aide at a diner 2 towns over and showed him the photos and the list. He did not react with praise or shock. He reacted like a man who had been waiting for a reason to act. He asked me for dates and witnesses and promised the governor would not be used as a shield for thieves. We recorded everything in case words would be denied later. Then something happened I did not expect. A neighbor I trusted came to me with a small recorder and a shaky face. She had been at the clubhouse the night the president met with a contractor who owed work and money and favors. She had hidden in a supply closet and recorded the whole conversation on her phone. She handed me the file and said, "I want justice, but I am scared to speak." Her hands trembled like a leaf. Her voice was small, but the recorder was clear. We listened in my broken kitchen with the radio off and the windows closed. The president's voice came through biting and soft at the same time. We heard her promise to move money, to hide receipts, to make threats thin like paper so they would tear if anyone pulled. We heard her name the treasurer and a lawyer we had seen at the governor's meetings months ago. The recording was a sting like a net thrown over a bird in flight. I sat with the recorder in my palm and felt the weight of the moment. We had proof, paper and voice and witnesses. We could hand it to the police, to reporters, to the governor's desk. But power has teeth and a short memory when it bites back. We needed a plan that kept people safe and kept the story true. I called a local reporter who had covered small scandals before. She came up the mountain before sunrise with a thermos and a notepad, and eyes that knew where to look. She met me at the ruins, and I gave her copies of the ledger and the recording and the names of neighbors who would stand by their stories. She promised to check facts and not to scream headlines that would put people at risk. She promised to be surgical with words and careful with lives. Meanwhile, the board did not stop in petty cruelty. They struck at the one thing they thought would hurt most: reputation. False posts appeared online accusing me of building without permits, of harassing elderly board members, of lying to get sympathy. Neighbors whispered doubts at first, because slander is a fast and cheap weapon. But the ledger and the recording were facts that cut through lies, like a knife through paper. One night as the moon grew thin, I received a phone call from an unknown number. A voice I did not recognize said, "You should be careful with that ledger. People get hurt when they look under stones." I hung up. My hands did not shake this time. I placed the ledger in a bank safety deposit box 3 towns over, and gave copies to 2 trusted neighbors and the reporter and the governor's aide. Proof lives in more than one place, so it cannot be killed with one strike. I walked home under the stars and thought about what we had become. We were no longer just victims. We were hunters of truth. We had the ledger, the recording, witnesses willing to speak. But the mountain had teeth, and the board had lost its fear of small cruelty. They would try to take everything from us if we let them. The storm broke the next morning, not with thunder, but with paper. The reporter's article spread faster than fire on dry grass. Front page of the local news, links passed around phones in grocery stores, screens glowing in coffee shops, ledger photos, snippets of the recording, neighbors' voices quoted line by line. For the first time, the whole valley saw what we had seen in the shadows. The HOA board tried to answer with silence, then with denial, then with trembling statements about misunderstandings and clerical errors. But the words fell flat because the evidence was too sharp, and the people had already tasted the truth. Once you taste it, you cannot spit it out. By noon, reporters drove up the mountain. Cameras pointed at the rubble of my mansion. Microphones pressed at my lips. I told them what I had lived through, the fines, the threats, the night of bulldozers, and the moment the governor himself saw the mistake with his own eyes. Their pens moved fast, their lenses clicked. I knew my face would be everywhere by morning, but I didn't care, because my ruin was now their stage. That night, the board called a secret meeting. We knew because the treasurer's car was spotted outside the clubhouse. We gathered quietly in the dark. A dozen neighbors crouched by fences and parked cars. Through cracked windows we heard their voices sharp with panic. The president shouted that the lawyer had abandoned them. The secretary sobbed that the governor's men were circling. The treasurer slammed the table and said, "If we go down, we take him down with us." And I knew who him was, me. My stomach turned cold, but I did not flinch. Because true is armor when lies come with knives. 2 days later, flyers appeared in mailboxes, ugly sheets with bold letters, claiming I had forged the ledger, claiming the recording was fake, claiming I wanted to destroy the community for my own revenge. Neighbors brought them to me with wide eyes, some scared, some angry, but not one of them believed it because they had seen too much with their own eyes. The governor's aide came back to the mountain. This time, he did not come alone. 2 investigators walked beside him with black folders and calm expressions. They spoke to neighbors. They took statements. They collected every note of threat left on my gate, every photograph of a broken mailbox, every receipt of double-charged fines, and when they left, the mountain road was lined with people clapping. Because for once, justice was climbing with them. But justice is slow, and revenge is fast. That same night I heard glass break outside. I ran with a flashlight and found my truck window shattered. On the seat lay another note written in that same sharp ink. "Leave while you still can." My blood boiled, but I did not tremble, because fear loses power when you look it in the eye and laugh. We gathered again in the ruins of my mansion, neighbors sitting on broken beams and cracked stones. We talked of next steps. Some wanted to sue, some wanted to rebuild, some wanted to leave the mountain forever. But I told them one thing: we cannot let them vanish quietly into the dark. We must drag them into the light, where everyone can see what they really are. The reporter returned with new questions. She told us the state attorney had opened a case, that subpoenas were coming, that accounts were already frozen. The board's days were numbered. But still, shadows moved around us at night. I could feel it every time the wind rattled broken glass in my walls, every time footsteps echoed too close to my gaze. 8. The board was cornered, and cornered animals strike the hardest. I sat awake at midnight with a lantern on the table, the ledger copies hidden safe, the recording backed up in 3 places. I asked myself how this would end. Would they flee? Would they fight? Would they try one last desperate blow before they fell? At dawn, I found the answer scratched into the dirt of my driveway with a stone. The word traitor, each letter jagged, each letter carved with hate. I stared at it until the sun rose. Then I washed it away with a bucket of water, because hate only lasts if you let it stay. By now, the mountain was no longer quiet. News vans camped at the base. Neighbors who once hid behind curtains now stood at their gates proud. Voices of anger turned into voices of unity, and still the board shrank smaller and smaller, their smiles gone, their power slipping like sand through a broken glass. One afternoon, the governor himself returned. No aides this time, no caravan, just one black car pulling to the ruined gate. He stepped out and stood beside me among the broken beams. He asked if I was afraid. I told him fear had already burned with the first wall that fell. He nodded once and said, "Then stand ready, because the final strike is near." His words echoed long after he drove away. Final strike. I did not know if he meant ours or theirs, but either way the end was close. I could feel it in the ground under my boots, in the silence of the trees, in the way the mountain held its breath once more. The board was desperate, the people were awake, and the mountain was waiting. The mountain felt strange that morning, like a place that had just seen a play end, and the audience was not sure whether to clap or cry. I walked the path to the courthouse alone with the ledger in my bag and dust still under my nails. Reporters waited at the steps with tired smiles and cameras that had learned to be gentle with stories that hurt too much to look at. Neighbors stew, awed behind them, like a slow wall of quiet faces ready to speak if asked. Inside the courtroom, the air smelled of old wood and coffee, and the weight of every small town secret ever told. The judge called the case and the room tightened like a held breath. The president sat at the front with a lawyer whose tie was too bright for a sad day. He spoke loudly and fast and tried to make the ledger look like a mistake of memory. But paper does not forget, and voices do not lie when a recorder catches the truth. Laws moved like glaciers in that room, but they moved under a summer sun this time. Evidence slid across the table and names were read aloud and receipts were shown where the words could not be denied. Neighbors gave sworn statements and the treasurer's face went pale as the ink on the pages found his lies. The lawyer tried to say the HOA had authority to protect property values in Harmony and design, but Harmony does not buy private jets or pay cash to hidden accounts. When the judge read the verdict, it felt like the mountain finally exhaled, guilty on counts of embezzlement and fraud and abuse of power, fines and restitution, and a list of things the HOA must now do to fix a community it had broken. Board members had to step down and were banned from serving in any community association for a long time. The president's husband, the one who had signed too many checks, was ordered to return money and explain where each penny went. They asked me if I wanted the money for repairs or if I wanted the community funded to help others who had been fined unfairly. I said neither at first because my chest felt full and clean, and I needed a moment to know what I wanted to build from the ruin. Then I thought of the neighbor whose car tires were slashed because he spoke at a meeting. I thought of the elderly woman fined for a purple flower that matched her late wife's scarf. I thought of the families who had paid in fear so long they forgot they could stand tall. So I asked the court to use most of the restitution to fix things that mattered to the people who lived here. A fund for those who were fined unfairly, a small repair grant for weathered roofs and broken mailboxes, free legal help for anyone who the HOA had harassed before, and a community center where meetings would be open and honest, and where children could learn how to plant trees and build things with their hands. The governor wrote a letter and sent men to help the rebuilding plans. He did not give me money directly, but he promised oversight and shared offices and a watchful eye so the same greed could not come back dressed in new papers. The board members packed up their things that week and left town like actors who had been fired mid-scene. Neighbors laughed and cried and hugged in the parking lot of the old clubhouse that felt smaller now the truth had been spoken in it. I went back to the ridge where my mansion had stood. The stone pile looked different in the light of a new plan. I walked through the broken rooms and left them as they were for a while because ruins have stories, And sometimes you must listen before you build again. Children from the neighborhood came with scrap wood and paint, and together we made a small playground near the fire pit where I had once mourned alone. An old man named Rafi sat with us and told stories of the mountain before the HOA had rules for clouds and sunsets. We painted boards and hammered nails, and the sound of laughter covered the echo of machines that once roared like monsters. People asked if I would rebuild my mansion the same way. At first, I wanted to, and because the house had been my work and my memory and my stubborn proof that I could make something beautiful. But as the weeks moved like careful hands across a plan, I changed my mind. I chose not to build a private palace again on that ridge. Instead, I helped design a long, low building of stone and wood where anyone could come inside and shelter from a storm or from loneliness. A place for meetings that were open and recorded for all to see. A place with a small library and a shelf of old cookbooks where neighbors could trade recipes, and a room where kids could learn to fix a bike or a radio. The governor visited once during the rebuilding and stayed longer than protocol allowed. He brought a simple note handwritten by his mother about the value of community and a gift of trees to plant along the road. He said little in speeches and more in small acts that meant more than loud promises. He shook hands and helped plant the first oak by the new playground, and his hands had dirt under the nails like a man who knew how to do small, honest work. The former president tried to leave town quietly, but people would not let her slip away without answers. She returned money and wrote checks she thought would buy forgiveness. Forgiveness is not for sale, though, and people wanted truth and changes, so the same hunger could not grow again in a different body. She performed interviews that sounded like rehearsed lines, and the mountain listened and then forgot most of what she said. Because truth had already been told in other places. More important than her words, time moved, and the scars softened, but they did not vanish. We rebuilt paths and fixed roofs and put shutters back on windows and painted mailboxes, not by rule, but by choice and taste. The clubhouse became a museum of the story, with photographs and the ledger framed like a lesson on the wall. People walked past it and nodded and remembered that silence only helps the cruel. Some nights I still lie awake and think of the sound of machines and the taste of dust and the face of the man who pointed at the wrong house that morning. I think of the way the governor nodded at me like a witness, and the way neighbors stood at gates like sentries of small justice. I lost a house, but found a voice and a place that was more than a monument to greed. And sometimes when I pass the playground, I see a child kick a soccer ball into a pile of stones and run away laughing. And I think maybe the mountain forgave us for a while. Maybe the mountain only wanted to teach us that rules are meant to keep people safe, not to make them small.